Alrighty then. Hey everybody, this is LMP Games, and we are back for episode 6 of our Arbitrage Maker MV plugin development tutorial series. This is going to be the last last episode covering the Dialog Selector plugin. So we're going to be finishing this plugin in this video. So, if you recall in the last episode, we talked about, we kind of reset what this series is about. Talked about what to expect from it going forward, what I expect from you going forward as a viewer, and then we went about actually making the changes we need to for the last episode, which was to take this plugin from just a list of dialogue that we went through, we looped through, or not really a loop, but that we progressed through plugin commands and whatnot to show that dialogue in an event on the in the playtest. But we took that, and then we decided, well, we didn't decide. We took that and we extended it out to be a map of data. That map of data, and again, a map, to redefine that, as essentially just like a key value pair sort of situation, where you have a key that stores a value, and then that's what's called a map conceptually in a lot of different languages. In JavaScript, there isn't really a map per se. Though there are like some functions that are called map, I believe. Those are JavaScript and not PHP. But effectively, a JavaScript object is a map. So we decided we're gonna take it from a list, make it a list of objects, and then each object in that list is gonna have a map. Essentially, gonna be a map ID and a list of the NPCs that are on that map, that are part of the plugin. And then that list of NPCs has objects that have the NPC ID and a list of the dialogue for the NPC. So we took our dialogue list and we said, okay, we're gonna make it be set up per NPC per map. And if there are maps that are not supported in the plugin, or NPCs that are not supported in the plugin configuration, then they won't. Ideally, that won't show anything, or they won't be using the plugin calls. But if they do get put into the plugin calls for some reason, plugin command calls, then we'll show something. That's kind of the last bit that we stumbled into, was that if you don't have a value associated with a game variable update, Arbitrage Maker MV does not update the actual game variable. It'll leave it whatever the previous state was. Which we're gonna have to handle that in this video. In addition to that, though, what we want to do in this video is we want to add conditions by which the dialogue is shown now. So we want to add switch, the ability to have switch conditions to determine if we should show dialogue or not. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to change our dialog map variable plugin setting again. We need to add in another layer of object, another nested object into there, which will be the dialog list. Instead of being a list, is going to be a list of strings. Will be a list of objects that will have the switch conditions, if there are any, and then the dialog to show if those conditions are met. And that should be the only thing we have to really change. We need to add in one new. Actually, we had the default dialog text. So we'll just use that in our, well, we could use that for this. For the whole handle the unused map NPCs or unused NPCs in the map situation. We could use the default dialogue for that. But here's the thing. This has always been for when the dialogue list can't be, whatever dialogues in the dialogue list cannot be used, right? So if the ID we're trying to pull isn't there, we're giving this as like a default text for that. What's going to happen now is if there are any switch conditions that are not met, and we don't have any other type of text around, like there's no dialogue text that has no conditions attached to it, then we're going to be showing this in that situation. So we can't, well, we maybe could potentially use this, I don't want to. So we're going to add a new plugin setting to handle that. That should really be the only thing we really need to do. Because everything else, I guess we need to add one condition down here. So let's actually go ahead and modify this right now. Oh wait, first of all we need to create a new branch. I'm glad I remembered to do that. Because usually I'll just steamroll on through on these. Get checkout. Branch. We're going to say 1.01.5 dash dialog object. Okay, so we're now on a new branch. We made this a branch, a feature branch off of 0.01.4. The code that we had from 4 is here now still. Again, it's up to you how you handle creating new branches and stuff. Technically, I should have created this branch off of working or off of master or something, but you can also just do it off of. Because technically, we're still adding new features onto version 1. So technically, with this new system that I'm doing, new naming system that I'm using, this should be created off of the previous feature branch. So, this should be fine. Okay, so, an invalid switch ID. Now I got the goddamn hiccups. You know what? We actually don't have to worry about that, because if we implement this in a certain way, you won't be able to select a switch ID. Won't be able to input a switch ID that is not valid. Okay, we're going to do it that way. That's a smarter way to do this. I'm changing my mind about how that's going to get implemented overall. Okay, so this is a map of objects that contain a map ID, a list of NPC data. NPC data list is a list of objects containing NPC ID and a list of that NPC's dialogue data. Dialogue data list is a list of objects containing the dialogue for an NPC, along with the conditions under which that dialogue should be shown. Okay, dialogue data should be a list of objects now. So it's going to be the conditions And this is going to be a list of switch IDs. And then the text to show. What did I call it originally? Actually, I didn't have this stuff. We're just going to say dialogue show. Dialogue. Okay. Or actually, that's in the wrong place. Oh no, that's in the right place. Right place, wrong place, right place. Right place. So, I think I mentioned it before, but these three dots, when you're talking about, they're called ellipses, or periods, which I'm going to use. But what these are what these signify is that there is more code after these. So, essentially, we're saying that after this, you could have more of these, or you can have more of this stuff, or more of these. Or that there's other things below this. It's kind of a shorthand way to say, here's what's different in the thing above, or there's other code below this or above this that isn't related or well, is not relevant to whatever you're putting this code in, like writing a question on Stack Overflow or something, or you're writing up an article or something like that. You could use these to say, well, here's the code that really matters. There's other code, but doesn't matter to this conversation or isn't relevant. So you can just put the dots down, and that's kind of universally understood as meaning that there is more code than what is posted. So that's basically how we're going to update our dialog map. We're going to do that by implementing a new struct for dialog data. So you have our default dialog, and then we're going to say for this setting we're adding, again, this is the one that we're adding that's going to be for text to show when an NPC is used within the system that is not supported in the system. So or if an NPC is on a map that's not coded, not configured in the system, it'll show then too. So we're not throwing out undefined errors because there's no configuration for those NPCs. We'll call it unconfigured NPC dialog. Text used when the dialog system is invoked. On an NPC or on a NPC in a map that is not configured in the plugin. So one thing we're going to talk about, we haven't talked about yet, because we really haven't finished this plugin yet. We're going to do this at the end, is creating the documentation for the plugin for GitHub. We haven't had to deal with that yet. Because we haven't finished the plugin, technically. Technically, we have not finished the plugin yet. And that changes this episode, but this is one of the reasons why I like using, I almost said Discord. Jeez, I've been using Discord for GitHub a lot last couple days. When you are using GitHub, what I like, and one of the reasons I like about using it is that you have this README file. And in the case of plugins, you can use the README to set up more comprehensive help documentation for your plugin than you can with the crappy thing that you get with the built-in help window. The thing's very limited. You have to count characters because you have a limited character width you can use. Character width just means the number of characters horizontally you can use. there's a limit on that, and when you go over that limit, the text starts falling off the screen or starts extending beyond the edge of the window. Let me actually show you what I mean. Let's see. There it is. So if I open up this, let's go to our thing here real quick. I'm just going to put in the help section really fast. Save that. Okay, now watch what happens when we do this. Let's go ahead and hit refresh. Right. Oh, I'm in the wrong block of code. Well, that makes sense. There. So you can see that your this line extends beyond the edge of the screen, and now you have a scroll, right? This scroll, having to scroll here, is a pain in the ass. So you have to write your help documentation inside of the plugin like this to a certain number of characters long, which means that one, if you're trying to do anything like explain a really complex system, you're going to have a lot more paragraphs or a lot more lines of sentences. There are across more lines of the help documentation to explain that. You can't embed images or anything like that. You can't highlight text, or this can't bold it or anything like that. It's just plain text. It's a very substandard, very crappy way of handling help text. Everybody uses it pretty much, except some people. I don't. I just say, you know what, if you want to see the help documentation, go to the GitHub page, because I can do so much more there, make it much more, formatted much more, so like every section is easily identifiable. You can do, headings and such. You don't have to use like character ASCII art to do any of that kind of stuff. And this is tons easier to deal with, right, than dealing with this stupid thing. So if you're going to be releasing your plugins over GitHub, 100% recommend you just say fork off to this help window thing here, and just put a link to your plugins GitHub page and direct your plugin users there. So we're going to be setting up the documentation for this plugin on the GitHub README. So, you don't need to necessarily include the development plan. I'm doing it for these videos to give it to you as like examples of what we talked about and what we did with this stuff. Generally, for plugins I release, though, I don't include this in those, which you can. Also, what I like to do too is I like to do a demo in a project file. So the demo will be the deployed demo for the plugin project. Then I'll give the plugin project as well, so you can see how things are set up, see how I've configured the plugin and how I'm using stuff. Because sometimes just seeing the help documentation and the demo is not enough, right? Sometimes you need that extra understanding of how something is being used. So I always have both the demo and the project be downloadable. Those I host on my website. You'll have to figure out something for yourself. But I would suggest thinking about at least doing the demo, if not both. Demo and the project. But, so, back to this. So we need to, the reason I thought about that was because of the description stuff down here. So we got that there, we'll need to add that in, we'll need to modify this stuff. And that's pretty much it, I think. I mean, nothing else here really is going to be an issue in terms of what we already have, because we don't need to add anything new. So, here is what we're going to do. Let's save that. So, first things first, let's go ahead and undo our change there. Save that. We're going to create a new struct. We're going to call it dialog data. Alright, let's go ahead and set up this struct. So, we're going to need two different properties here, same as these other ones. We'll need a param that stores the conditions, and then one that stores the text to be shown. So, at param, we're going to say conditions, at description, list of switches that, when true, will allow the dialog to be displayed. Then for the type, we're going to use at type, and we're going to say switches, or switch or switches. Which one is it? So I think I mentioned this before, but you can see here, let me turn on this so it's a little bit more large. You can see these types here. These are all database types. You can use these to allow the dev to select something from a database object without having to just like type in an ID. It's a much safer way to handle doing that because they can't just type in any random ID, so it's going to be something that's in the database. Whether or not it's actually something that's been configured properly, like set up properly, that's another story, and it's not really something that's on you as the plugin developer to worry about. But at least preventing them from putting in like a negative number or an invalid ID that's not been, initialized for whatever type they're working with. This is the best way to do it because it won't let them pick what they've set up, that they've initialized in the database through like the add more kind of button, or whatever that's called. Very, very handy for things. In this case, though, we're going to use skill, and we're going to put our switch, and we're going to put the list notation after it, so we have a list of switches. And this should just be a list of IDs, essentially, when we load it into the data. Default, set up the list. Okay. Parameter 2, dialog. Description is going to be, this is the dialog that will be loaded, will be displayed say dialog text to be displayed. This is going to be a text type. Default string, empty string. Okay, so now we need to add in our. Let's get that ready. We need to change our dialog list from what it is here to a list of dialog data structs. So let's go ahead and change our description of this because it's no longer just that. So list of dialog data. So I'll say a list of dialog data configuration objects. It's going to be a struct dialog data. Okay, there we go. Now we have that in. And we shouldn't have to do anything else to support this. The parsing function we wrote in the last episode should parse that automatically on its own without any other need for us to do anything. The only thing that might be a little bit interesting is the ID list, so we'll have to see if that gets caught up by this or not. Anyway, so the other thing we have to do is we have to change this to, or not this, we have to add one more, that's what it was. We have to add one more of these in for the unconfigured dialog setting. So, unconfigured NPC dialog. Turned when an invalid, when an invalid map or invalid invalid map or NPC is reference is used with the system. So for this one, we're going to actually give a different type of message. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to tell the developer when they're playtesting that they screwed up. So the default value for this is going to be something to the effect of, hey, this NPC or map has not been configured in the Dialog plugin, Dialog Selector plugin configuration, essentially. And that'll tell the developer that, oh, I've either used this on an NPC that I didn't configure into the plugin data, or it's I've used it on an NPC that's not supposed to be part of the system, so I need to change what's going on. So we'll go ahead and put that in. That seems a bit long, to be honest. Well, let's just say it's not been configured. That's the one thing you have to worry about when you're dealing with like stuff you're going to be outputting into a text window is that you have a limited number of characters and you don't really know what they're using plugin-wise that might limit that even further. So we're going to deal with it this way. There's one detail I glossed over, which is we're going to be putting in Yanfly's message core plugin, which allows us to do a specific thing called word wrapping. And what word wrap does is it essentially takes a string of text that you have, so some text you're displaying in a window. If it would exceed the length of the window, it will create a new window. Well, first of all, it'll move dialogue down to another line, text down to another line if it will exceed the length of the window. And if you exceed the number of lines in a window, it will create a new window automatically. So using word wrap is a good way to set up large amounts of dialogue and not have to worry about creating a bunch of show text events in the editor. The downside is one, you have a long line of text in your event now. That's a little bit harder to deal with. And two, you can't control the ending points of the lines. So you'll have things that are kind of uneven, which actually, I'm wondering if we can use line breaks. Let me just see what happens if we use this with word wrap. If this works, this is going to be perfect. Alright, so we'll do that. So we're going to add in Yanfly's plugin as well. That's not something we really have to do anything within our plugin for. We just need to have that available. Now, if we wanted to, we could add in a plugin setting here that enables the use of word wrap if the message core plugin is being used, but since it's a free plugin, and pretty much anybody making a game in RPG RMB is going to be using that plugin, we can safely assume that they have it. I think the number of people making games currently over the last probably 5 years that have not used Yanfly's message core plugin in them is probably in the single digits. Potentially. Unless you're doing something very specific like a game jam where you can't use plugins or something like that. Just because it's that wide, it's not endemic to the community. It's like, if you wanna make a plugin, if you wanna make a game, you're gonna use some of Yanfly's plugins. If you're doing that, you're gonna be using the message core plugin because it adds a bunch of stuff that you really need to have. And this is one of those things. So we'll see if this works. Yanfly's plugin does a little bit processing of text codes a little bit differently. So I'm going to see if that will actually create a new line or not. If it does, then we can control new lines, which means that you can write your dialogue a lot more naturally than just letting the plugin break it at specific points where the text would go over, and then not be able to control, like when you might have like a partial window of dialogue because you finished a statement and you're going to continue onto another new topic or something, new paragraph. That's something that this plugin, when you're using word wrap, doesn't really let you do unless this works. Because what I've found is normally when you're just doing this, you have a huge thing of dialogue. It'll cut it up based on the line length and then the number of lines, and it'll just keep doing that until it's run through all the text you give to it. There's no way to, so far I haven't found a way to give it something that will say, oh, create a new line here, create another new line here, and then now we have 2 empty lines on a window, and the next line of text is actually going to be the next paragraph on a new window kind of thing. So let's see if we can actually make that work. So that'll be very useful if we can. So yeah, there's that. We need to then put that down there so we can import it. Change that, change this to unconfigured dialog, and we're good. So, now, the next thing we have to do is we have to modify our setDialog variable function. So we have to do a couple things here. First of all, we have to add in support for the condition list into this. We need to add in support for displaying the unconfigured dialogues, so that if we have a situation where one of these values is invalid, that we're telling the developer, hey, you got something wrong with your configuration, or you're using an NPC, or have an NPC on a map that's not part of the system yet. So let's start with the latter first, because that's a little bit more of an easy thing to deal with. So how would we go about doing this? Well, we could just say, well, we have this thing up here already that we're using to do this test thing, right? What if we just say this, make this be unconfig dialog, and then whenever we just do this at the beginning, and then did I type the name up there? Unconfig. Oh, I did. Dialog. Whenever we come into here, we'll just set that unconfigured dialog thing there by default, and then from here we just say if we have dialog we're going to show, we'll override it. I mean, that's a fair assumption that you could make. If we were not changing the structure of this function for this version of the plugin. If we were keeping this the way it is, that would absolutely work, because at that point you're always going to have some dialogue being shown, either if it's a default dialogue or the dialogue from the list, because there are no conditions on whether you can show it or not. By adding conditions, though, we're essentially saying at some point there's going to be a situation where the dialogue that we want to show can't be shown yet, and we need to show either some other type of dialogue, like the default dialogue, or we need to show nothing, or show the previous bit of dialogue that was set. So by setting this up here, we're changing this value, and what's going to happen is that we're going to display this unconfigured thing when we really should be displaying what the previous line of dialogue was, because the next line of dialogue isn't valid yet to be shown. The NPC in the map is configured properly, but we're showing that we're saying that they're not, which is not correct. It's invalid to do that. So what we have to do is we have to handle this differently. So we can't do this up here. So we have all these if conditions, right? So what if we took these conditions and said, on all these else's, we set the game variable value to this thing. So we did something like this. What if we just did this? Right? Seems simple enough. So, I mean, it isn't wrong, but it's not the best solution. Because what if you change the variable names here? Well, you have to change them in all 4 of these places. So what the better option is to use a boolean to set here in these else's, and then we're going to have that boolean used to do a condition check. If it's true, then we're going to use this line of code there as opposed to in all these places. This is still 100% valid, because this is a specific case where we're more of a gray area at this point, because we just have one line of code that we're putting in these, right? It's not like we're writing 3 or 4 different, like 3 to 5 lines of code or more in these for each one of these. At that point, I would say write a function to handle it, because then you're going to have significant code reduction from that. You wouldn't do a function in this case because you just have one line of code. Granted, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code, but you're going to end up in a net zero situation where the function that you wrote to handle this is going to take up about that many lines of code. So there's no reason to reduce it like that. Because you're just replacing this variable set with a function that we'll call the variable set, and what's the point of that, you know? You're essentially just shifting the call, so it's more correct than this is, obviously, because now we have this in one place instead of 5 other places, or 4 other places. This is actually still correct up here for the moment. So you still have this in 4 other places, in one place instead of 4 places, so it's only one place to change, but you still have a net 0 code situation because all these else's are still going to be there. So all these else's are going to be regardless. So the better option is to just do this. So we're going to say if our say param is valid. Yeah, there's an argument that you should start booleans with a B, or they should always be like start with like an is or an R. As long as the variable name states a question, it's a valid Boolean variable name. And as long as that question is, you know, obviously readable and understandable and stuff. Param is invalid's pretty straightforward. If one of these parameters is not valid for any reason that we find in here, then we need to do something about it. So we're just going to take this down to here, put that in there. And then we're going to essentially take this, we're going to set this to true in all these instead of doing this. So let's go ahead and copy this up to all these. And then we need to do the declaration and initialization up here. Okay, so now we have implemented again, this isn't, I wouldn't say this is optimal. It might be, well, it might be optimal for the situation, but it's the better way to do it. Because now if we have to change any of these, we just change them here once. If we have to change this, they're all in the same function, so it's pretty easy to just use Control-D to select everything. And VS Code, by the way, Control-D allows you to select multiple lines at once. So if you have to change a thing, it's like, let's say we're going to change this to parameters are invalid. So we'll say params are invalid. So we can change all these at once without having to use the find and replace functionality by using Control-D. That's a handy tool that VS Code has. Some other editors have it too. I know that Sublime Text has a plugin you can install that does that. That allows you to do that. Atom had a plugin that allows you to do that. It's built into VS Code by default though. But we're going to leave it as param is invalid because that makes sense, and that's going to handle that. So the other thing we have to do though is interesting. I just noticed something I should have noticed in the last video, which is that this if statement is not consistent. Tell me if you can see why it's not consistent. I'll give you time to think about it, and you can put it in the comments what you think about this if statement's not consistent with the other if statements. You can have a discussion amongst yourselves if this is a valid thing, which I think it is. So why I just noticed this and say it's not a consistent if statement is because this if statement is checking for negative conditions. How do I know that? Check it out. Or. So, an easy way to tell, now, I didn't look at the or, but this is a tip for you. If you're looking at an if statement and you want to know whether or not the conditions you're looking at are negative conditions or positive conditions, so conditions that are positive are things like, is a value defined, is a value inappropriate, is the value appropriate for what we're using it for, and a negative condition. It's a condition like, is a variable undefined? Is a variable value outside of the range of what we're looking for? Is the length of a list 0? See, now you kind of understand here. And the easier way to figure that out, though, is an or, because when you have negative conditions, you're going to be using an or instead of an and. You use an and when you have positive conditions. In other words, each of these conditions has to be true in order for you to continue. When you're looking at negative conditions, In that situation, you use an or because if any of the negative conditions is true, you want to stop. Not if all of them are. So if we set and here, right? What would have to happen for this to be done is the length has to be 0, and the index has to be less than or equal to, or greater than or equal. The length has to be less than or equal to the index. So you might think, well, that makes sense because the index is 0. If the length is 0, the index won't be within the length. But what if the length is not 0, but the index is still larger than the length of the list? At that point, you got yourself a bug, because then what's going to happen is we're going to bypass this because both conditions aren't true. The length is over 0, but the length and the index, this is true, this is false. So this isn't going to evaluate to true if this is an AND. This will evaluate to false if the length is not 0. So we're going to come down here, we're going to put in this index, and we're going to get an undefined and being returned to our text. And technically it should actually throw an error, but because JavaScript is the way it is, it doesn't. This is a very handy tip. If you see an or anywhere in a conditional statement, you're checking negative conditions because you're looking for conditions that, well, you're either looking for negative conditions or you have two different sets of positive conditions that are they are exclusive to each other. Like, for example, is this value a 2 or 3, and is it a even number, or a 2 or 4, or is it an even number, or is this number a 8 or a 12, and is it not an odd number? It's not a good example, but that's kind of like what I'm talking about. So what you can do is you would have like two sets of, and you can also identify that kind of situation by seeing if those conditions are wrapped in a parenthesis group like this. So if you see anything where you have parentheses around conditions in a conditional statement, and then you have conditions after that, that's an example of those kind of exclusatory groups of conditions as well. And whenever you have a series of conditions that should be evaluated together, and then the rest of the conditions in the if statement should be evaluated, always use parentheses, because like with math, stuff in parentheses is evaluated first. So if they should be evaluated together, so like if we have some AND conditions here, so like length is 0 and so if dialog list is not undefined and dialog list length is 0, or if dialog list length is well, let's do this, and this is not really a proper example either. It's kind of hard to come up with examples of things on the fly when you're not actually making them intentionally. So this is still not quite proper as well. What I would actually do is I would reverse this. This would be the single one out here, and then we'd have an and this would be inside of a parentheses with an or. These two would be, because they're both exclusionary. So if length is 0 or this is there. The reason we're not checking for undefined here in this case is because this should always be something because of how the plugin data is structured. If the plugin data is invalid somehow, we're not going to get this far down into here. So we have a little bit of an assumption we can make there. Technically, for proper defensive programming, we should actually check to make sure this is not undefined. But this is one case where there's enough other things that if that happened, the rest of this wouldn't work either, where we're actually kind of, that would be caught before this point, right? So we don't really need to check it again. But it is something to consider. Yeah, so this if statement is wrong. So what this actually has to be is we have to change the conditions and flip them. So instead of being 0 and the ID is greater than or equal to the length, we have to go if the dialog list length is greater than 0 and if the index is less than the length. So So there we go. So this is now consistent with all the other if statements. All the other if statements are positive statements. This is now also a positive if statement. Condition check. We do need to flip this around though, because this is now reversed where it needs to be. Yeah, I did not catch that in episode 5. As somebody mentioned it in the comments, good picking it up. Leave in the comments below if you think that's actually a problem or not. And I'm inviting potential flame wars, but let the flame wars begin, because why not? So we now have our thing written correctly. So now we need to handle the dialog list a little bit differently, because we changed what it is. It's not really a list anymore, it's an object list. It's not just a dialog list. So we're going to change the name to dialog object list, because it's a list of objects now, so we should change the name. We still keep this the same because it still makes sense. The length is greater than 0 and the index is less than the length of the list, so we know if the index is inside of the list. Because if the index is less than the length of your list, you'll never have a situation where the index does not exist, right? Whatever number this is, the element will exist in your list if the length is larger than the index. So once we get that in here, we want to then pull out our we want to pull out the object itself. Select dialog object equal dialog object list index. And now from here we need to now think about how to handle the condition list. So conditions. Because we're dealing with switches, we need to pull out the switch IDs first of all. Well, we need to get the switches from the switch data. Now, what we could do is we could loop through all the switch data and do like an actual for loop. If the IDs match, then do the put it into a thing. But we can just do that with a filter, because filters do essentially that, but a little bit faster probably. So we're going to say let conditions equal game switches we need to check something out. So here's one thing about the game variables and game switches object variables. They actually contain a class. It's not actually a list or anything like that. Or at the very least, it's an object that has functions that then access a list. Because in the case of both of them, we have a property of these called data that actually stores the switch data and the variable data. Which is why when you're working with game switches and variables, you use value and set value to get and set, because those are functions that are properties of game switches that allow you to then modify the data in whatever this is, class object or something, whatever this is. It might just be a regular object. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and load up the editor really fast. Oops, I'm going to close that. And let's see what actually the data is in there, because this would be a good thing to figure out. Let me turn this on. I think we have to start the game to get into there, so we'll do that. So we're going to say game switches. Okay, so it's a class, yeah. So it is a class. Then we have this underscore data array. I think this is because we don't have any switches defined. Potentially. Yeah, we don't have anything defined. So let's put a name here, say test switch. Interesting. So it also doesn't have any data in it unless they get set. That doesn't make sense though, right? Huh. So they're in the F9 list, but then Oh wow, there's a bug. Okay, so on map load. I didn't think about that. So because we put this on the initialization for this on map load, we essentially just duplicated the data because so what I used was F9 that opens up the switch and variable menu, so you can go through and like turn things on and off when you're debugging and testing. This opens up a scene, and when you go back to the map scene, it technically reloads the map. So we're actually duplicating data because of that. So we'll need to make some changes once we find out how to get these switches showing. Oops, I'm going to close that. This is interesting though. I didn't realize that the data array was empty. That seems very strange. Why would that be? Why would that be empty? Does it only show switches that are turned on? If that's the case, that's an interesting, interesting thing. Okay, so actually, yeah, so it has an empty element because we have we want these to be indexed to the ID of the switch. So yeah, so it only has this in here if it's true, it seems. Let me turn it back off and see. Okay, it's in there now, so that's interesting though. So we have to handle two different states here with this. This is bloody annoying. So, okay. So here's what we need to do. First of all, we can't rely on undefined to mean anything here. Because undefined now is a condition we have to check. So this is interesting. Interesting. Okay, let's finish this. Let's finish this off. Dot filter switch. So switch dot crap. I think it was just dot ID, right? It wasn't underscore ID, or was it underscore ID? Usually they use underscore ID for things like this. Interesting quirk here. Oh, it's actual index. There is no ID on there. It's just an array of true or false. So it's the index itself. That is going to make this a bit harder. So let me turn this back on so you can see what I'm doing here. Let's see if we can do something here. Game switches dot data dot filter. I think we can do this. I think it's this way. Do we have to wrap this in a function notation? Yeah, okay, so one thing you can do with the filter is you can actually also pull in the index with the filter. So you have the reference to this. So switch is the SWT is the actual element, and then the index is the index of the current object, current element you're looking at. So what we can do with this here to make this work, because we need to also make sure that we're not pulling in the undefined. Because like if I do this, like let's say we have 0 here. Well, we're going to pull in that empty undefined element. So what we need to do is then have another additional check for the null to make sure that we don't pull anything undefined. So if we do this, we're going to get an empty list still. But what we're not going to get is So maybe actually empties don't have an index, which is wrong, and no, that can't be right. That has to have an index. Data. Yeah, undefined. So why didn't we get that back with this? Does it not return undefined, maybe? I know that's not the case because I know it does. Interesting. So, does filter not return undefineds? I've seen this used to keep undefineds out of the list for forever. Let's see, JS array.filter. Okay, so filter does remove undefined. Interesting. How was I... Is it find that doesn't? Because I know for a fact that I was getting undefineds out of something that was coming out of this database data. Maybe it was find and not filter. Yeah, it's fine. Okay, find is the one that does that. Interesting. So I could potentially reduce some of the complexity on these filters I'm using then. Huh. Well, you learn something new every day. Okay, so apparently filters out the undefined variable, so we don't have to check if it's valid. You do have to check if it's valid on find, though. So you will still have to do this check for an undefined to make sure that the element's defined. But like I was saying for switch, though, you can use the function notation to add in another parameter to pass in the index to. So in this case, do we need to do that? No, I think, yeah, because it's the second parameter is always index. If we just did this, I think it's still going to be... Oh, that's interesting. So, huh. Oh, I know why. Okay, yeah, that's why. So, since we were using the loose comparison operator, or just the normal comparison operator, essentially what this was saying was if index, which was actually just the switch data, was true. So in other words, if it's not undefined, this becomes true. Because we're not really comparing this. This is not a comparison against the number 1 here. In this context, this is a comparison against true or false. If I did that again and put 0, it would return nothing. Oh, it might return the first one. Yeah, it would return nothing. Because the first one's undefined. So this is now a truthy check because we're using the 0 and the 1 as a true or false. To see if this has been defined or not. So we'll need to use the strict comparison operator here for this. So filter, we don't need this anymore. We do need to change this. Turn this off. This index, add that there. And if index... Or rather, I'm thinking about the other thing. This is, we want to do... we want to check to make sure the index is in the list of conditions. Duh. What I would say is we could absolutely do this. This is 100% valid to do this. This is 100% valid. However, it's a little bit long, right? So let's just do this instead. Let condition list equal this. and then this becomes that. It's a bit of a nitpicky thing here, but it makes it a little bit more readable. It's a little bit more readable, and a little bit shorter. So it's a little bit better. You can do it either way. Either way is valid. This is just my stylistic choice to do it that way. So we have our condition list. We have our conditions now, which we got from filtering the data. Now, because we need to handle undefineds, right? Because we can have, there can be, unless the switch has been set initially to true or false, it won't be in here. So we need to check to make sure that the length of conditions matches the length of condition list. If those two are the same length, then we know that all the conditions are present, and that means that we can continue. If we don't have all the conditions here, we know that one of them or more has not been set, and we can just assume that the condition list that we have is going to end up being false when you check to see if they're all true, because obviously there's stuff missing. So we'll do an if statement here. Condition list length is not equal, or actually equals. We're going to positive conditions here. So if the lengths are the same, then we know that we can continue. Otherwise, we'll do our. Well, actually, it wouldn't be this because it's still valid. We'd do the default dialog thing. At this point, it looks like maybe default dialog has to have the same treatment as this, potentially, because we have multiple conditions now under which that will show up. But let's just continue to implement the rest of this, then we'll deal with that when we get to it. So we have our condition length is, this is wrong again, equal to length, and if that's true, then we know we have all the conditions present. They aren't necessarily all true, but they are present, so they've been set at some point, either to true or false. So, what we need to do now is we need to see if all the conditions are true. So how do we do that? How do we see if a unknown amount of conditions are true? Well, we do another filter. As crazy as that sounds, we do a filter where the value we're checking to see is if it's true or false. And if it's true, that'll come back into the new list, and in that list we'll check against the conditions length again. And if the lengths match a second time with that filter now, we will be able to say that all the conditions are true. If there is a condition not in the list, that means it's false. And then we have our condition list is not evaluate to true in totality. So let true conditions equal conditions.filter, because this should just be true or falses at this point. That's all this list should contain, is a true or false. SWT, and if SWT, and we're going to do a strict comparison here because we want to make sure that we're checking if it's true or not, not if it's been defined or not. So if the value of this is true, then pull it in, and then say if condition list conditions true conditions.length is equal to conditions.length. Now, this is where we do this thing now. So we just check that, so we do this, and we use the dialog object dot dialog. So now, like I was saying,
we're going to need to handle the negative condition now. So it's going to show the default dialog. And we're going to do that by using a boolean as well, because we now have enough that's going to make sense to do. If it was 1 or 2, I might let that slide, but we have 3, so it'd be better just to do a boolean for that. Rather, let's go let's all condition, let's see, yeah, this is another interesting thing where if you want a boolean parameter to be true or false, and then you want to switch it to false or true for the thing that triggers the thing to happen, right? Generally, you want it to be false to not have a thing happen, and have it be true to make a thing happen, right? And not go the other way around, where if it's true, something doesn't happen, and if it's false, something does, because that's kind of backwards of how booleans usually are meant to work. So in our case, we need to rename this thing, because this does not match that. So, failed conditions present. And then if failed conditions present is true, then we're going to display the default dialog. We could say that this might not be worded correctly still, because we're checking for if there's even a dialog object to begin with in this case, or if the index is valid or not for this one. So this isn't really about the condition list specifically. So it doesn't necessarily say why what the failure that happened is, but we're saying essentially that we need to show the default dialog because something did fail. And that's a little bit more correct in terms of like handling what this is. Like this isn't a condition as in like a switch condition. This is a condition more broadly in terms of like coding condition, not a specific switch condition that's part of the object that we're looking at, and it's false because it hasn't been set to true yet. It's a condition checking if the dialog list has anything in it, and if the index is valid, and if one of those is false. That's not really a condition because we named these conditions down here, so that causes a little bit of you have to think about that a little bit in terms of what you want to name this boolean. Because you want to make it describe all the stuff it's covering, not just a specific thing. Now, if this is called something else other than conditions, like we called it switch list and switches or something, true switches, then we could use condition up here, because then that's just referring to the conditions of the if statement. Because we have something named conditions, that changes what the name would mean. And that's just part of writing clean code is parameters, the meanings of parameters change if there are other parameters, other variables named in a way that makes them linked, right? So, whereas, this is fine if this is, switch list, switches, and true switches, because now we're saying this is a list of switches, then failed conditions is fine, because that now means that we're talking about if conditions. So, if this condition fails, and this is a failed condition, so true. If these switches aren't, correct, if these switch checks are not correct, those are conditions that have failed now. But because we call these conditions, that changes the context of this name, right? Failed conditions present now means specifically that we have conditions that have failed the checks down here. Not that this has failed. And I know it sounds like a really, dickish thing to be stuck over, but this is part of writing clean code, is making sure, and readable code is making sure that, your variable names work together and make sense together, and don't conflate their contexts together to mean something entirely different than what you want them to. And this is like one of the more nuanced things about writing clean code that not a lot, I would say, well, probably people in the professional space think about this stuff a lot. Like hobbyists, which I used to be one of, don't think about that kind of stuff very often because it's not really a, you know, naming a variable something in another variable that has a similar name, you know, that doesn't matter. It's, you know, they're two different things, and I know what they mean. You go away, you come back, you're like, well, here's these things named they're named the same thing, they must be related now. So, you know, do yourself favors by thinking about the details like this. So we're going to call that show default dialog, which will then show default dialog. And I think at this point we are good. I think we have now implemented all this stuff in here. Oh yeah, one last thing. So we need to store. So we can handle this bug here in one of two ways. So just to refresh, this bug is when we're loading up a map, we are processing the map data, parsing it, and storing it. The problem is when we load up another map, we're re-parsing the data and it's being added and we're duplicating. We don't want to do that. So we can handle this one of two ways. We can either move this to on-game load, or we can move this to on-database load, or we can put in a boolean that says, if data has been parsed, don't do this. Which I am partial to in this case because it makes more sense. So we're going to say map data has been parsed equals false. So if map data has been parsed, is false, then we're going to run our process map data function. If it's true though, we're not going to. So we're going to have that there, we're going to set to true once it's done, and this is going to prevent us from duplicating the data when we're having the map scene reload. Alright, let's go ahead and load this into our folder here. And then we have to do some reconfiguration. Let's go ahead and close this. Alright, get this back up and we'll turn on this. And now, let's go to our plugin manager. We're going to hit refresh. Okay. So, we have our unconfigured dialog. We have this. Oh, also, let me grab, before I forget to do so, let me grab the message core plugin. I'll add that in as well. So let me cancel this real fast. That should be put in above your plugins. So any plugins you make that use yep message core should be underneath it, because you require the functions to be loaded to use your stuff. So let me turn on this, and let's go ahead and start configuring this. So the map data should still be here because we didn't really change this. What we'll need to do is down here in the NPC data, we'll need to set up the dialog list because that will have changed. So let's open that up. Ooh, that's an interesting thing. So because we changed the property of a struct, it's in another struct, it's in a list, I think that we'll need to actually delete and re-add the plugin from the list in order to make it fully update, because I think the refresh doesn't update that data, or it might just be able to remove the values. Because like what should happen is we go to here, we go to this, go to this, This is interesting. How come it's not? This is not the right. This should not be this. This is supposed to be another thing of objects here. Yeah, I think the configure. I think we need to remove the plugin and re-edit. I think at this point, we've reached a point where the refresh doesn't really work so well anymore. Let's go ahead and remove it. We're going to add it back in. Either that or we've had a limit on the number of objects you can nest within the editor, which is freaking stupid if that's the case. That should not be a thing. Unless we didn't set this up right. Oh, there's a typo. Struct data. There we go. I didn't notice that until right now. Okay, let's go ahead and copy that back over. That makes perfect sense why that wasn't working now. Well, we already nuked that out of there, so we can't really do anything about that, unfortunately. Yeah, there we go. Okay, cool. There we go. So let's go ahead and head back out to the map level here. So map 1, that's fine. NPC list 1, dialog list. Okay, so no conditions for this dialog. We're going to say okay, no conditions. We're going to put another one in. This one we're going to have a condition be switch 1. So we're going to say NPC1 dialog 2. Oh, instead of list of strings. Interesting. That might be something we'll need to look into. How to handle. We might have to cast. Oh, actually, the value we're passing through from the plugin command is also a string, so actually that should be fine. Well, no, then it should be. Well, we'll see. This might be a case where we need to now parse the data coming in from the plugin command to properly work with this. We'll see what happens. This is going to be. Just as like the first NPC will be a test. We'll do a little something more complex in the second NPC. So no conditions. Dialogue will be okay. Condition. So we're going to do something a little bit different here. For this one, we're going to use. Essentially, what's going to happen with this one is that. Actually, you know what? I think we need to think a little bit more about this. I think we need to. Remove. Let's go back here a second. I don't think we need to do the index check anymore. We don't need to do this actually, because what's going to happen now is we want whatever conditions are true to be what matches, right? So I think we need to make this a loop, and whatever the first dialog object that matches our conditions is, we need to use that. So instead of checking the index, because we're going to remove index as a parameter on the plugin command. So we don't need this. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say for let dialog of dialog object of dialog objects list. Actually, no, we don't want to do this here now because Just because we don't have a condition matching on the first time through doesn't mean that we're going to have that be an issue. We'll explain what these are here in a second, and what we're doing, and why. Okay, so,